Good morning. Welcome to this morning's webinar on safety orientation. This webinar is going to give you information to assist with your company's safety orientation at your dealership. So we've got a lot of information to go through this morning, and we've got a full list of attendees that have been joining us as well. So we look forward to that for all of our members today. I'd like to acknowledge and thank John Schmeiser of QUIDA and Marty Cobb of the Motor Safety Association for working together to set up this partnership where we can offer these webinars to the membership of QUIDA on a quarterly basis. You may have noticed that your microphone is muted, and we've just done that to eliminate the feedback that we have received in the past. Sometimes when we've done these webinars, we get a bit of feedback and distortion. However, the chat box is open, it should appear on the bottom of your screen, and that chat box will be basically our way of communicating with each other throughout the presentation. So if someone could just drop a note in there that they can hear me okay, or if there's any feedback issues, we can work through those and stuff. So I will await till someone gives me a type in the chat box that they can hear me okay, then we will proceed with this morning's webinar on orientation for safety. Great, thanks Lisa. When it comes to safety orientation, it doesn't matter if you have 20 minutes experience or 20 years experience. People still need to be orientated for safety at your dealership. And this webinar will give you some ideas of different ways we can accomplish that. A little bit about the Motor Safety Association. For those of you who've been to our webinars before, this may be a little bit of a review, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. We are a safety association in Saskatchewan. We are a non-profit, non-government association where we look after Saskatchewan members when it comes to safety training, shop inspections, noise level testing, ergonomic assessments, and audits. However, we do work with other parties in other provinces if they do have questions and inquiries, but we are limited to our travel to Saskatchewan only. One thing that may be new that you noticed from last presentations, on the bottom here, we are now on Twitter. So feel free to, if you're onto Twitter, to sign up and to give us a follow, because we do send out some safety-related information regularly with Twitter. So today's agenda, what we will discuss, we're going to highlight some of the reasons why we conduct a safety orientation and why that's critical. We will look at some of the safety orientation topics, some of the safety orientation guidelines and questions. I will show you guys a sample safety orientation checklist, and at the end of the presentation I'll unmute all of the microphones, which will give us an opportunity if there are questions that you want to ask in person. We could do it at that time, or like I said, you can enter them throughout the chat box throughout the course of the presentation, and I can answer them at the end of the webinar, and we will be available via a telephone or email contact as well. So let's look at this scenario. An employee starts working at your dealership. They report to work at 8 a.m. and they receive a basic orientation. The basic orientation could include, say for example, wage benefits, pay schedules, applicable forms, email addresses, and parking. So they get all that basic stuff taken care of. The employee starts working. And what's missing with this picture? The safety side of it's missing. A lot of times in orientation, this may be all that a person would receive. That's what we want to talk to you about, give you some ideas of how we can roll out the safety orientation. Sometimes we see stores where they want the technician to start working as soon as possible and start generating revenue. But the problem with that is if you let an employee start working at your dealership before receiving a safety orientation, the seed's been planted. This is how the company views my safety at the dealership. If we're going to do a safety orientation after harvest, or if we're going to wait till a rainy day, that shows me that those things are more important than that employee's safety. They also run the risk of this new hire, this new employee, learning from current coworkers that are on staff at your dealership. They may do the safety orientation impromptu. They may have their own opinions, which may be different from that of your business. So that new hire may not be getting the exact information that should be receiving when it comes to safety. So keep in mind, building a safety culture starts on day one, so you want to embed that correct information for your new hire. So what are some of the benefits of a safety orientation? Well, it is a well-known fact that inexperienced workers in general are involved in more accidents and have higher accident rates than others when it comes to safety. So by orientating our workers on what their safety requirements are, we will see that they're going to work safer in their dealership. They're going to be happier. When they're happier, they're more motivated. They're more efficient. We're going to see more billable time on your work orders. We're going to get those people that are working safely, which that reduces the financial loss in your dealership, because people are going to be safer and contributing and doing the tasks as they had planned as through your processes. And ultimately reducing an employee turnover. I know in the industry everyone's struggling to hire technicians and keep them, so when we get the technicians on our payroll and working for us, we want to make sure that we can keep them safe and working at our dealerships. So what does an effective safety orientation look like? Some tips that we've come across are you want to align your start dates to your pay cycles. So if you have mass hires where you're hiring large amounts of people, if you're in a dealer group per se, you could limit your orientations for safety to 2 per month. And then that way you can educate the people. Say, for example, you do the process twice a month instead of twice a week. And that way it's going to be a lot more efficient for you as well to deliver that message. And it doesn't become redundant for the person delivering the message as well. If you're one of those businesses that needed someone yesterday, you may want to practice continuous recruiting by keeping your talent pool full of qualified, safe workers, so if the need arrives that if you are short-staffed, workers won't be taking shortcuts and rushing to make up for the loss of having a missing worker or missing staff or short-staffed. So that's one way of keeping it effective as well. The buddy system is awesome. This allows for an older, more experienced worker to mentor a new worker that comes in. So they'll work under that direction of the buddy, and this basically allows for on-the-job reinforcement, either positive or negative, when it comes to safety, so the corrective actions can be implemented. So we can talk about what are the things we need to do to correct if there is some unsafe behavior. So having a buddy or mentor working closely with that new hire is critical in keeping them safe at your dealership. After the orientation, employees should be assessed for their understanding. So that's where we do testing, perhaps, or we look for acknowledgement that they understand what we've discussed in the orientation. And with the orientation tool that you're using, allow that orientation to be evaluated and evolve. If you're using the same orientation form that you were using in 1995, we're going to have some problems because hazards have changed from that time frame to now. So as hazards and standards and regulations change, our orientation for safety needs to evolve so we can be rolling out the best possible process for our technicians when we are doing the safety orientations. So once we are getting into the portion of where we conduct the safety orientation, it's important to try and relate the subject matter to the employee. Sometimes safety orientation can be dry, especially when we're focusing on the regulations and the rules, and that's sometimes it's hard to deliver that message. So what we've came up with a bit of a guideline or policy, or not a policy, it's kind of a best practice when it comes to rolling out that message to the workers for safety in an orientation. A good practice is to perhaps allow about 25% of the time of the safety orientation to discuss specific OHS regulations. So that would be the Act and regulations. What are the specifics, regulations that they're required to be aware of for their job? The other 25% of the time to talk about your company or dealership's specific safety rules and what are some of the best practices and company protocol for safety applicable to the technicians at your dealership. And then the other 50% of the time, to what are the job-specific duties and tasks and how these regulations apply to them. So we can kind of take the legislation, we can take those rules, and then we can explain to them why it's important and how it applies to them. So some of this documentation that you could use for a safety orientation could be a handout for the worker to take home with them to reference after they're done, a quiz so that they're competent, those sorts of things. When you're doing the safety orientation, you never ever want to give the impression that this is the first and last session of orientation that they're going to get when it comes to safety. You expect people to work safe for you at your dealership, not only on the first day, but every day after that. So it's going to be practiced and continued throughout employment. So you want to have the door open when it comes to safety so people can always ask questions, because there is a lot to digest during a safety orientation for information. I want to reference a study here that we've recently were looking at our location. And this was a study that was conducted by Professor Derek Chapman of the University of Calgary. And when we talk about safety and orientation for our workers, we take it one step prior to that. What about during the job interview when we are sitting down with potentially hiring technicians or dealer personnel at our locations? So what this study explains is they go through and conduct your interviews as per you normally would during a job interview process, and then at the end of that, they had utilized a 30-minute behavior-based risk assessment survey. And what this does is it allows you to basically profile the personality of the potential new hire before you actually hire them into your dealership. And it allows you to determine what they may be as far as their overall profile when it comes to safety, if they may ignore your safety program, those sorts of things. I do not have a copy of the exact survey that they use, but the link is listed below here. And I do have the 4 categories that they do feature in this profile interview for when they are hiring through that process. So for example, the first area that they look at is panic. So if something were to go wrong, is this person likely to panic and make it worse? Or how do they deal with that? What about recklessness? Are these potential hires impatient? Do people cut corners and take risks? That's an area that's looked at. As is safety defiance. Do they have low respect for safety authority and rules? This could lead to complacency. As well as distractible. Do people pay little attention to detail, and are they not focused? So this is basically a survey that they had used to go through the process right at the hiring stage to determine if someone poses a risk to them at the dealership once they're hired. So I thought that was kind of a different way of viewing the orientation by taking it a step prior to sitting at the hiring desk and looking at people's personality and profiling them before they get to your dealership floor. So now that we've kind of went through some of the benefits of the safety orientation, I want to talk to you about some of the safety orientation topics. At our safety association, when we do core certification audits, these items on the next 3 slides are items that we look for as far as documentation to prove due diligence for safety orientation. The orientation itself actually plays a huge part in the core audits. So I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of these important things that we look for when we are doing audits when it comes to safety for orientation. So the first one being your health and safety policy. Does the new hire understand the policy? We're not looking for them to recite your health and safety policy. We just want them to understand your health and safety policy, the general philosophy of it, and where it's located. How about the worker's 3 rights? The right to know, the right to participate, and the right to refuse. We're looking for acknowledgement that they have received information and understand their workers' 3 rights. As with their responsibilities, we all have responsibilities for health and safety, so right at the orientation stage, people need to have that information communicated to them. What are their responsibilities for health and safety? And that's something that is looked for as well on the orientation form. What about reporting? Hopefully this is something that is discussed. In the event that someone were to be injured, obviously we're hoping that doesn't occur, but if an injury were to occur at your dealership, the new hires and the people and staff need to know how they report that injury. I was working with a dealership a couple of weeks ago, and a technician got injured at 3 p.m., went to the doctor, and the doctor said, "You're off for a week." And the technician never bothered to communicate that information to the service manager. So the service manager is wondering, where is this person? When are they coming back? And this is kind of a problem because the reporting process didn't work properly because the service manager had modified duties that this injured worker could have been doing. They said, I could have had this person counting some inventory because we're doing inventory right now. I need some customer phone calls made and some processes like that. So this was an opportunity where just by missing how the orientation, the reporting process wasn't discussed. So this new worker did not know that he had to report his injuries and that there was a process in place. So just keep that in mind. Another orientation topic is accountability. At your dealership, do you have a disciplinary process? Is there a 3-strike rule? If somebody doesn't follow the rules, do you guys have a verbal warning, a documented warning, as well as a dismissal if someone isn't following the rules? So whatever your accountability program is, that's something that the new hire should be orientated on when they start work at your dealership. Another thing specifically is your company safety rules. So there's a lot of generic rules, but what specific rules apply to your dealership? Say, for example, what personal protective equipment am I required to wear? What is the rule for that? What do I do for lockout, tagout when I'm working on equipment? So that your specific safety rules also need to be communicated to your technicians or new hires. What about the location of your emergency equipment? Where is the defibrillator, your fire extinguishers, your eye wash stations, your first aid kits? Ask your new employees when you go through the orientation and you would say, so, okay, I've just explained this process to you, so where exactly is our defibrillator? Where's the first aid kit? Get them to reiterate that to you, to understand that, so you understand that they know where it is. That's very critical. I'd like all new hires to know where those things are, if they need it or if one of our staff need it. It's a good segue into the facility tour. This sometimes gets overlooked. When a person gets hired, they may receive a tour of their basic work area or workstation, but they may not receive that complete tour of your dealership. And what if they need to find the fire extinguishers or the eye wash stations for them or for somebody else? If they haven't received that tour, how do they know where those things are, such as all the emergency exits? So that's why it's so critical to identify the facility tour, because in some areas there may be restricted areas that the people aren't supposed to go into or prohibited areas. So if they are, that should be communicated during the orientation so people understand that. Which leads to the next point. Identification of those restricted and prohibited areas are critical. If people don't know that they can access or shouldn't access these areas, it should be laid out in the orientation so it's clearly communicated. New hires should also receive an introduction to your safety committee and the first aid attendants. They need to know who they would take their safety concerns to. So whom is on the safety committee? If I have a concern, who could I take that to? Same with the first aid attendants. If they need first aid treatment, who would be the person applicable that is your dealership's first aid attendant? I've seen at some dealerships they've actually posted pictures on their safety bulletin board of their committee members and the dates, that basically the terms, how long they're going to be on the safety committee for, and the first aid attendants with their pictures. This is a good process, especially in larger places, because sometimes people may or may not recognize people by name, and they would by face or picture. So what about some of the job-specific hazards? This should be covered in your safety orientation. So if someone is going to be exposed to high noise levels, standing for extended periods of time, ergonomic hazards, those need to be identified during the safety orientation so that the new hires are aware of those applicable hazards and how they can address those. As do relevant job procedures need to be identified. How do I do my job safely? What is the procedure on how to do this job safely? Because I don't want to get hurt, nor do I want to hurt anybody else. What about your dealership's emergency response plan? How do we evacuate? What's our evacuation procedure? What do we do if there's a tornado? What about a flood, a fire, a power outage? Where's our muster point? These things should be clearly communicated during the orientation so people understand what this is and practice. You guys, people should be doing routine fire drills and emergency scenarios so people understand if this were to occur, how we evolve with that process and practice it. As with our return to work program, this is so critical to be explained to the worker right on day one. New hires need to understand that you have a return to work program, you have modified duties. If the doctor says that you're going to be off for a week, that's not going to happen. I need you back in the dealership tomorrow as long as we can get you to work so that you can participate in the return to work program, because we have modified duties for you to do at your dealership. This will not only save you thousands and thousands of dollars at your dealership, but it's also critical in integrating that injured worker back to work as soon as medically possible so that they can contribute to your workforce and, of course, to keep your premiums down as well. And housekeeping. Poor housekeeping leads to injuries and property damages. Slips, trips, and falls make up a huge percentage of injuries in your rate code. So you want to explain to new hires, this is your bay in the service department. I expect you to keep this clean. If you spill oil, put some Zorbol down and clean it up. We don't leave that out for a week. And our garbage cans overflowing, those sorts of things. So housekeeping is an area that needs to be addressed and communicated during the orientation for workers. As does your company safety program. If you have a complete safety program or safety management system at your dealership, it's a great opportunity to conduct that to your workers so that they explain it to them. This is the policies and procedures of how we do things for safety in our dealership so that they understand it. That's something that maybe some places may have and some places may not. A lot of people are working towards implementing their safety program or have it ready to go as a living, breathing document. So communicating that to a new hire is critical because you want them to know this is how we value safety at our dealership. This is how we value that we want to keep you safe. So showing them and getting them involved with their safety program and having them understand it is critical to keeping them safe at your dealership. And same with the job descriptions. When you do the initial advertisement for that position, there's some descriptions in there that you'd utilize. But what about the safety side of it? What are some of the safety requirements for that job description? So that can also be communicated as well. And you want to ensure people have documented training records, that people have taken courses, that you can keep that documentation and store those training records. I do want to touch on a tidbit of advice, though, when it comes to storing your training records. We don't want people to store their safety training records with private personnel records. Due to privacy and HIPAA legislation, you cannot store those records together, because what if you have different people needing access to those forms? Say, for example, if the safety coordinator needs to pull some forklift training records, and if it's mixed in with personnel folders, that may not be what you want in your dealership, unless your safety coordinator is the person who's doing your payroll and normally has that access to that information. But if not, I just want people to be careful of that, so you're not storing information together, and you don't, where people who should or shouldn't have access to it are viewing it. A good tip is, it is so much nicer to keep it separate, because if an OHS officer comes into your dealership, they're going to want to see those training records. So having them readily available in a separate location is going to be your best option for that. So just a bit of advice or a bit of a plan of how you can roll that out or plan to in your dealership. So while we're still on training, employees must be appropriately trained to safely address hazards that may be present. These trainings should be provided on hazards specific to their descriptions. So what specific hazards are they exposed to for their job descriptions, and are they trained for that? Is there a safety training plan or training matrix? If we hire new staff, do we have a plan? Do we want this person trained on forklift operation, overhead crane, WMIS, first aid, CPR, those sorts of things? So do we have a training plan? Do they have some of these courses already? So those are things that we look at when it comes to training, and ensuring that they meet the training requirements and that they enroll in the applicable training, if so required, at your dealership set out by your training plan or matrix. So this is critical too when we're going through this safety orientation and understanding the training side of it. Sometimes these orientations could take a half a day, it could take an hour, or like I said, it could be an ongoing orientation where people have to, are expected to work safely at all times, and the orientation is expected to continue, if you will, so that people can ask information about questions if they do require clarification. So some other information regarding orientations: have them signed and dated. However, if you don't understand the information, do not sign it or date it if you are the new worker, or if you are the trainer and you didn't deliver this information, don't sign or date that category, because we want people to be competent and understand their orientation. So by going through that and ensuring that people sign off when they're competent is critical, because we don't want a check mark in an area. They check off, yeah, I understand this, and they come back to reporting and we have an issue. And they'll say, well, I didn't know that. And you'll, yes, you checked off right here at your safety orientation that you do understand it. So we want to make sure people are understanding of it. That leads me to the next point. Is your safety orientation reviewed? As a new worker, I know I've changed jobs before, there's so much information to take in, whether it be through your initial orientation as well as your safety orientation. And when I was doing safety orientations, at the end of it, I would meet back with the worker at the end of the week and go through the checklist again. Do you have any questions? And clarify it and go through that. And again at the end of the month. So, okay, this is the stuff that we went through. Any more questions? I know there's a lot of information to digest, just so they're understanding, they're clear on it. A good practice, and actually when we do our core audits, we look for this, is an annual review of your safety orientation. We're not saying we expect you to orientate your workers, walk them through, give them a facility tour of your dealership. What we're looking for is documentation that at least once a year you've pulled out your safety orientation form and have discussed it at a staff meeting or a toolbox talk meeting. And basically the awareness is there. Because if I was a new hire a year or two ago, sometimes things need to be refreshed. So by doing an annual review of a safety orientation just helps people thinking about safety and ensuring that what that information is refreshed for them. It is true, a new employee can be expected to absorb only a certain amount of information in the first few days. So sometimes a good thing is to, give them a copy of the orientation or a brochure or your safety program, something that they can use as a review or a handout. And this also helps the person conducting the orientation that they understand that they didn't miss anything on the checklist, and that it works quite well as a good reference point for that new hire. So as an employer or supervisor, it's so critical to be accessible. Even after the orientation has occurred and the people are on the job working, when they're cut loose and ready to do their job, stick around, watch the worker, make sure they're doing the task safely and correctly, and if there are any mistakes, to work with them and address them. Because if you don't correct that, they're going to think that's the accepted practice, and that will continue. So you have to basically get that right at the beginning and not let that worker develop these habits and correct them. Sometimes workers they feel pressure to get it right the first time, and you need to be patient with these people. We see in young workers, ages 18 to 25, they are at the highest risk for safety hazards. They sometimes overlook these hazards just to get the job done quicker. They want to please their managers. They want to be working, and they usually have a lot to, I don't want to say a lot to prove, but they're at an age group where we've seen a lot of injuries in that, and they're trending in that category. So be patient with these workers and just try for them to work with them and so that they're not overlooking those hazards and they are working as safe as they can. Some other guidelines to be aware about is personal protective equipment. What is your policy for hard hats, steel toe boots, and gloves? Workers need to know about your policy. They also need to know how to use the personal protective equipment, how to store it, and how to maintain it, and where to go if it is damaged or lost. So where do I go to get more personal protective equipment if my other stuff is damaged or lost? How do I store it? Do I leave my respirator sitting on my workbench, or do I seal it up in a Ziploc bag and put it in a safe place? Those are things to be aware of when it comes to personal protective equipment at your dealerships. And we always tell people, ask, ask, ask. It's so much better for someone to ask how to do the job safely opposed to them having to do that job incorrectly. So then we have to pull a technician off another job, and they have to redo that job. So we've got extra labor costs, we've got extra parts costs, we have some lost time and efficiencies. So it's so critical. If somebody asks you a question, you too have a role to answer that question to the best of your ability, and be patient with the workers, because we've all started jobs before. We didn't all start as experienced workers, so we have to be patient. And if somebody asks us a question, we want to do our best to answer it for them so that they understand how to do their job safely. So that's why it's so critical in the orientation to understand that people understand what you've said. We sometimes work with groups such as, when we're at a dealership, we may see people that have language barriers. They may be ESL, English as a second language. So when they receive the safety orientation, there's a lot of head nodding. Yes, yes, I understand what you're saying, but in reality, they may not. So you could go to them and say, can you show me that again? Or why is that necessary? Or can you explain to me why we do it that way? So by just posing the question back to them to ensure competency is critical, because like I said, there's so much information to take in, and people may just nod their heads and they may not even understand what you're saying. And we see that so much. There's so many immigrant workers and people who struggle with the English language, and it's so critical for them to understand safety because they are in a very high category for risk as well when they may not understand your safety policies or procedures. So we need to spend some extra time with those people as well when it comes to delivering the safety orientation. So a little pop quiz. I'm going to ask a question. Do I need to orientate contractors or temporary workers at my dealership? So if I bring a contractor in to do some work at my dealership, or if I'm short-staffed and I go to a temporary worker agency and bring in temporary workers, do I need to give these groups of people safety orientation? So let's think about that for a second. The answer is yes. If you hire contractors or temporary workers at your dealership, you, the employer, are ultimately responsible for these activities while they're on your premises. These workers not only pose a potential danger for themselves, but also your regular staff. So if you bring a contractor in who may not be following your safety rules or may not understand what your requirements are for safety at your dealership, and they may cause an injury to them as well as your staff, that's a problem. So I see some places they have a contractor safety orientation form that they go through a contractor when they have someone on site at their dealership doing work for them. As with temporary workers, depending on how long they're going to be with you, obviously you still want to go through that safety orientation because, like I said, if they have 2 minutes experience or 20 years experience, they need to be safety orientated at your dealership, because they can introduce new hazards and they won't be working to what your safety rules or requirements are at your dealership. So a couple other things to discuss when it comes to orientation. Now that we've talked about what we should be conducting as far as the orientation and some of the benefits, who's actually going to be doing the safety orientation? Well, the main thing is the person delivering that safety information at orientation needs to be competent and knowledgeable. You don't want somebody just reading from a script, reading line for line, this is our safety rules, and they may not understand it themselves. This person, whoever is delivering the safety orientation, needs to be able to answer questions. They need to be a reliable source of safety information themselves. So if a question arises, they need to be able to answer that. So it could be a human resource personnel, your safety manager or coordinator, a supervisor. I've seen even safety committees have done the safety orientations, the co-chairpersons of safety committees. So like I said, whoever's doing it, they need to be able to do it and deliver that information and be competent. I do recommend, too, if it's a human resource person doing the safety orientation, to separate them. So we're going to do our basic orientation first, which I spoke of earlier, about our payroll, parking, all that stuff pertinent to human resources. And they can also do the safety orientation as well. So it's good to separate those things as well, so that it could be the same form, there's no problems with that, but just don't lump it all into one process. But the main thing is just to be sure that the information is getting done and people are being orientated on safety at their dealership. So once they've received that orientation, at that point, like I said, it's good to turn them over to their supervisor, their foreman, the lead hand, or that buddy who's going to be in the buddy system working with them to observe the hands-on training. At that point, the supervisors are still ultimately responsible to determine if that employee is ready to perform their work activities. So the supervisor has to be sure that these people have received the safety orientation and that they understand it and that they are competent in it, and that if they are going to be starting to work right now, they're going to be working safely. So keep that in mind as well as supervisors. Ensure that your workers are trained on safety, that they're ready to go, and they're going to work safely. So when it comes to using specific forms to do the orientation, everyone can use basically what's going to work best for them or at their dealerships. There are many different forms available. I've went online, I've checked up different forms. The internet has endless samples and examples that you could use for safety orientation. The main thing is to make it effective. Keep it simple and effective. Highlight those key points I spoke of. Those are some of the minimum requirements, but feel free to exceed those requirements and add some more things that you feel relevant to your orientation, but keep it effective so that it focuses on those key components you've outlined. And make it specific. Don't just download something from the internet and that's not relevant to your dealership. Make it as specific to the workers so that they understand it and can explain it and comprehend it. Some people use tests as part of the orientation. Here is a test that we expect you to complete, and by completing this test, we now have due diligence. You prove that you're competent and you understand our safety orientation. So that's something that you could look at as well, in addition to forms that you could utilize for safety orientation. This here is a sample safety orientation checklist. This is actually just one that we quickly drew up in the office that just kind of basically highlights some of the orientation items that we discussed in this webinar. So this could be basically a minimum requirement. You could obviously exceed this, but this is just some of the areas that we outlined as important when it comes to safety orientation. As mentioned, there are a lot of different samples on the internet that you could use as well, or to make your own. So we talk about the different categories we look at and the initials. So once it's been explained, the trainer themselves would sign off and the worker could sign off. So in some categories, I've seen where the trainer has signed off on safety rules, but the worker hasn't. So the trainer delivered the message on it, but the worker still didn't sign off because they wanted some more clarification. So that's great. You can come back and do that to make sure that people only sign off when they understand what is the requirements for safety orientation. So that's positive as well. So this here is just kind of a basic form that we use, that we made up. So once it's completed, there's a section for the manager to sign, the supervisor, and the worker, and to date it. This is due diligence. If you do not document your safety orientation, as far as OHS is concerned, your safety orientation did not happen. So and we've run across that. I've asked people if they do safety orientation. They said, "You bet we do. Can I see some?" Geez, it's more or less a verbal thing that we do. We have no checklist. We have no process. So here's something that you can use if you don't have a process in place to help you along the way. So that could be beneficial as well. With that concludes our presentation on safety orientation. Our next presentation that we're going to do for our webinar is going to be on lockout tagout on January 15th of 2014. We will also be attending the QIDA conference in January 2014. So please stop by our booth to visit us because we're always looking for feedback and ideas for future webinars, because the information that we receive is critical to keeping these webinars ongoing with your feedback. We will also have a copy of this webinar uploaded to the QIDA website in the next few weeks. So if you weren't able to attend the webinar, you would be able to go in and get into that information and check it out at that time. So I've unmuted everyone's microphones right now, and I have the opportunity for people to ask questions. So we're getting a bit of distortion and feedback, but if the people want to verbally ask a question now, they can. Our phone number is also listed, our email address, and our Twitter handle. So I will stay online for the next few minutes. If people have any questions, they can do so. If not, we will be able to communicate with us at that time. So thank you very much for your attendance at the webinar today, and I look forward to any questions that may arise.
Wow, it's overland flooding. It's not. Yeah, but the thing is this is because we're
or in addition to questions, if there is any feedback, what you liked or didn't like about the webinar, that information is quite useful to us moving forward.
Right. I don't know. He might have bought. He's smarter. Probably bought insurance, but they didn't have their insurance to cover this much, but not the whole section.
With that, it looks like there was no other questions available, so I thank you guys for your time for signing into this morning's webinar. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Feel free to follow us on Twitter, give us a phone call, or email us at any time with your safety questions or concerns. And we look forward to perhaps seeing you at the next CWIDA convention or at our next webinar. Thank you.